Are you aware of any Afghans arrived in the UK under the secret Afghan resettlement route during your time as Secretary of State? If yes, roughly how many? It's unclear if any of these arrived before the election. The first invitations on that were issued in April 2024.
So I missed the first part of your question.
Sorry, are you aware if any Afghans arrived in the UK under the secret Afghan resettlement route during your time as Secretary of State?
Am I aware of any who did? Well, the numbers show that they did, yes.
How many?
I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay. So you don't know how many?
Not exact numbers, no. James, who you just heard from, was the on point.
Did they arrive before you left office?
Oh, certainly people were coming to the country. Absolutely, yes. I mean, you know, there was a throttle speed for the number of people that we could get out for the reasons that you've heard about. I won't repeat them. But you couldn't get more than a limited number of people out in any given period of time because of that throttle speed. The numbers were remained in the low dozens and hundreds over a period of time because you just couldn't pull people out fast.
Okay. Thank you, Raj. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you.
Sorry, just before I come on to yourself, I believe Lincoln Job wants to ask a quick supplementary on this.
I don't think we can just... it was a very clear answer you gave to Mr. Twiggs' question about when did you find out about it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you turn up, new job, first day in work, and they say, there's this massive secret that we've been keeping from the country.
Yeah.
And it's enormous, and it's going to cost billions of quid. What's your reaction?
Well, by now, it's, I think, the sixth department that I had become Secretary of State of, so I was used to walking into departments with big problems that, and I'd been in the Home Office briefly, I knew about big problems that were landing on your desk day one. And so my immediate response was, right, I need all the facts here. First of all, when did this even happen? And it turned out it was 2022. Okay, when did we know about this leak? And it turned out that halfway through the previous month, this Facebook post had gone up and then been redacted and removed by Facebook. What is the overall impact of this? Well, the Taliban could be now targeting a list. If they notice it's there, we need to get these people moved pretty bloody quickly. As with every department I went to, find the facts, identify the problems, and then what are the solutions that you need to put in place. And it was exactly that process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kelvin Bailey.
Thank you. Can you give us an insight into why decision making within government under the cover of the injunction took so long? Or took as long as it did?
So I think actually the decisions were being made pretty rapidly. The problem was, it goes back to Mr. Twiggs' question, that there was a throttle on the speed at which you could remove people from the country, both because, bluntly, you had to get them out of Afghanistan via illicit routes with fake information. That's how you get them across the border, you're smuggling people out of the country. That's not an easy task, and as Mr. Heapy was just saying, the routes would become known by the Taliban, and then that puts people's lives at risk and so on and so forth. So there was this natural... And then actually you need to get people relocated from Pakistan, which was the route, into the UK, which required that relocation package. So I think that the institution of the state often criticised was actually pretty quick. The frustration was that even if you threw every single possible institution of the state at this problem, you could not move people faster than we were moving them. And believe me, we tried. Could there be somebody else that removed people from the country? Was there another organisation that could achieve that? No and no, so on and so forth. So I don't think the state wasn't acting quickly. I think the state found it had very few options.
Okay, we've just heard from Mr. Heapy that you struggled, or the department struggled, to get adequate responses and information from within your own department. So why should we be as accepting of that response? It took, 3 months for you to agree on the initial cohort of 150 people?
So the situation's not, as ever when you can look back on these things, you get a 20/20 hindsight on them, but if you think about how this came about in the first place, there was that unexpected pull out of Afghanistan.
Which was a failure of government.
But in particular by
it was a failure of
Biden administration in particular.
No, it was a failure of our government because the Foreign Office failed It's something that I'm intimately involved with because I helped evacuate 14,000 people, which was an initial assessment by the department of 7,500 people. So the department had its figures wrong initially, right?
Well, look, this is now before my time, so I'm observing this, but it seems to me that no one was expecting Biden to pull out of Afghanistan as quickly as he did, and then when he did, no one was. Yeah, no, fair enough. I'm not.
That is the job of government.
I'm not here to defend something which wasn't in my period. I'm just commenting on it because I think it's important in context. And then when he did, no one expected the Taliban to take over quite as fast as they did, or perhaps you did, and others did foresee that. But that is the reality of what happened, and people will remember imprinted on their minds the chaotic scenes of people hanging to undercarriages of aircraft leaving.
I do, very clearly and very personally. But the point I'm making is that in your analysis you accept that we made a failure. We failed to preempt that. That is government's job to balance risk and make sure that there is things put in place such that those risks can be managed appropriately. That is what the military is. It is an instrument for the state to balance risk. Mr. Heapy was quite clear that you were unable to draw from your department decisions that information that he felt necessary to make decisions. And in response to asking why your department was so slow to respond, I would like to know why Mr. Heapy's premise that the department was failing under your leadership to be able to provide that information in a timely fashion.
Because I think that the detail required under what were, as you described, chaotic circumstances that had preceded this were such that no one was ready for a data leak that then caused the necessity to essentially lift a number of people out of the country, which in the end looked like turning into a large number of people out of the country. I am not sure that I entirely agree with Mr. Heapy's interpretation that it was anything other than, in fact, I sat here and I just heard him say it. It was very, very difficult to sift through those that were, let's have a go and apply to a scheme that looks like it can give you resettlement in the UK, and were genuine cases, and those who were just filling in essentially a form that had been copied around with blank spaces to fill it in. And I think that is the thing which was causing the problem, just trying to disaggregate the real applications from the others. But Mr. Heapy would have been very close to the detail on that. That wasn't the way it felt to me. But it felt to me that this is just a very complex, messy situation that essentially I came in as Secretary of State and needed to try and resolve.
The thing is, Mr. Shapps, the point I'm trying to make is that the absence of, if there was appropriate political will to reach in and see these things through, these things can happen quickly. And we've heard about the mess and the challenges that the departments faced with each other about where you're going to relocate these people. So my question is about political will and leadership.
No.
If there was the political will, was it at the wrong level? Clearly there's problems inside the department.
Just to reassure you, Mr. Bailey, this had my absolute attention, as the records, and I think you will have had all of the paperwork show, occupied a great deal of my time and was a constant pressure to resolved. I recognised more than anything else, as you or anyone else would have done if you were sat in the Secretary of State for Defence's chair, that there were people's lives on the line and that we had to make the machine move as fast as humanly possible. Now, it is true that you had all the various different tensions of where you relocate people to. And again, as I just heard Mr. Heapy say, it's perfectly right that a housing minister is concerned about housing and so on and so forth through other ministers. That's a necessary tension, but it was not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem that I faced every single day was how you increased the throttle speed of getting people out of the country, and that was the real problem.
And I assert that was done in the comfort of your office, in the absence of parliamentary scrutiny and the public pressure under which you would have been feeling had this been out and been exposed to parliamentary scrutiny. There is an amount of pressure there's amount of pressure that would have come about as as a result of direct parliamentary scrutiny that would have meant that you would have been able to have placed your hands across on some levers in other government departments through perhaps a COBRA, because this should have been managed through a centralised...
It was being. You're mischaracterising this, I'm afraid. And let me just say, first of all, I wish that we could have better briefed Parliament. We briefed Mr Twigg and others, but it was a fundamental problem that the need to protect lives, including, as it turns out, British lives, meant that the knowledge of even the fact that there was a list, let alone the people on the list, could have put those lives at risk. Nobody in my seat would have made a different decision, number one. Number two, it is a mischaracterisation to say that we weren't feeling the pressure every single day to solve this. We were feeling the pressure because, apart from anything else, the judges were making it very clear that unless we worked every single day to resolve this, then they wouldn't be able to sustain the injunction. So the pressure was coming in a different way, not the most preferable way, as you say, but for good reason.
That's not a mischaracterisation then, is it? What I'm saying is that you were not under parliamentary scrutiny.
No, but we were under court.
You did not have... They're different things. They cannot be the same, because otherwise our parliament isn't effective. And the point I'm making is, would this... there is a balance between the exposing an amount of information or a problem and using that to coalesce pressure across government and maybe elevating this up under the Prime Minister, because your other government, you didn't know about this, you said this yourself, you were in 6 other departments, all of which you said were failing. You arrived with six big problems. But so you were used to coming into departments with challenges, which is what you said at the beginning.
Which is not the same saying.
You arrived in a department with where a big problem was presented to you, which meant that you didn't know about it before arriving. So it cannot be the case that there was a cross-government approach to this problem, or knowledge had leaked beyond the purview of the legal protections that you were asking for. So you were doing this in the absence of the pressure that public scrutiny would have been applied to you, and you were doing it, therefore, without the support that would have given you to reach across other government departments.
First of all, I mentioned as in other departments, and every department has its problem. I didn't say every department was failing. Secondly, it is of course true that I was doing it without the scrutiny of parliamentary pressure, as you say. Obviously that was the case because it wasn't in Parliament. But there was a different type of pressure that unless you have been under, you may not fully appreciate, which was the pressure from the law courts. And in this particular case, they're being very, very strict about what they felt needed to be done, both in terms of briefing and providing opportunities for briefings to both the speakers of the House, the leader of the opposition, who certainly at one point did not take up that briefing, but the Shadow Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretaries who did. And so it was not that there was no coverage, but of course you're right to say that there wasn't that scrutiny. However, you're then saying, and therefore somehow you weren't using all of the arms of the state, you weren't pressurising others, there wasn't a coordinating function through COBRA or other kinds of committees that got to the same thing. That is not true. All of those things were there, and the records very clearly show those cross-departmental meetings took place on a very, very regular basis.
Thank you much. Emily Orr.
Thanks, Chair. Hi. So on the day before the general election, you decided to appeal the High Court's decision to lift the injunction. Can you tell us why that was?
Yes. There was a concern, essentially, that the risk to life, both Afghan and British lives, was on from the moment of the breach being known, was on a sliding scale down. And I accept that over the time, and believe that over the time, that as we got more people out of the country, and as time passed, because other people will have just died through natural causes or moved elsewhere or what have you, then that risk does decrease. And I always thought that it would be a matter of judgment between when the risks to life, both British and Afghan, and the disadvantage of keeping an injunction in place would cross over. And I thought that time was probably going to be around the autumn of 2024.
Why?
Because of that sliding scale. The further away you get from the moment that the breach is known, and today, the more people you've got out of the country. And also because, for two other reasons. One, like the rest of the committee, Mr. Bailey and others, I do believe that we should have parliamentary scrutiny. And it troubled me that we weren't able to, matched against the idea that we must save lives. And so at some point you get the crossover where it's been long enough. I would say that... Sorry, I'll stop there.
Sorry, can I just... I'm just trying to get my head around. So obviously that was July, and you're saying you think things would have changed by the autumn.
I thought that was probably the last time to renew it, and it was coming up regularly. And so
on what basis, though? I'm just wondering, what advice were you getting? I would say in that short space of time, the situation would have changed.
Well, probably in 2 or 3 months. As I described, there's a sliding scale, and the problem that you're really putting a finger on here was no one could tell you. I mean, believe me, I asked, dozens of times. No one could tell you with any level of certainty whether or not the Taliban had this list. And so part of me was thinking, well, for all we know, the Taliban have this list. They've had it all along, and they've been going around executing people. And so you could lift the injunction, and it wouldn't make the blindest bit of difference because it doesn't give them anything new. But was I certain that that was the case? No, I wasn't certain. And so each time that it was renewed, I had to be more than 50%, I thought, likelihood that they did not have the list and this would risk lives. But over a period of time, they're either more likely to have the list or more people who would move and what have you. And I felt like we were getting towards the 50-50, but not quite there. By the way, interestingly, my successor decided to keep it in place a whole nother year. So my successor's judgment was we weren't anywhere near that 50-50 point, clearly.
So that would be how you would reconcile, because I know you told the Today programme in July this year that you don't think it should have carried on as long as it had. But what you're saying is you were making that judgment, which your successor did as well. So I'm just trying to...
Yes, because
trying to pin you down on...
So my successor carried it on for a whole nother year, so longer than I had it in place for. Or
they could have been doing that presumably on the premise of what you've just said, that they needed to be 50%.
Oh, I see, yeah. I mean, if you take the same sliding scale, he would have been taking his own advice. And I'm afraid, actually, in the end, you could take all the advice you wanted, and the whole thing came down to judgment. You'd read the secret intelligence, and you'd try and make a judgment. How likely is it, and this is the simple calculation, it's really black and white, how likely was it that if the injunction was lifted, that people would die? That was the calculation. And in my judgment, we were getting towards a crossover point where the chances are that the Taliban probably already had this information and that therefore this could be lifted. And I've tried to, through open source, largely, monitor the situation since the injunction's been lifted, now winding forward another year, and I've seen nothing that indicates that there have been an increased number of Taliban attacks on the individuals. So I think that it was probably kept in place for too long. I think it was coming towards its end, but I thought that the autumn was probably going to be about the right time. That was in my mind. My mental model was, in the autumn of that year, 24, we'll probably stop seeking to renew this.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sir Grant, I just wanted to confirm the fact that there was a complete lack of democratic accountability, of transparency, as has already been pointed out. But why did you initially resist your officials' advice to brief the Shadow Secretary of State for defence on Privy Council terms?
Yeah, so it was only for a short period of time, but first of all we needed to establish all of the facts, and given that we provided multiple briefings to the Shadow Secretary of State and where he wanted them to the opposition leader, it wasn't a desire, and indeed to the leaders, to the speakers of the houses, it wasn't a desire not to include them, it was merely a desire to establish facts before we started to spread this further.
When you say briefly, you only how long is briefly?
I mean, it will be in the. I can write back to you. It will be in the file there. But it wasn't a particularly long period of time. What I needed to do. Yeah, I think about a month. I think that's probably right.
You decided not to brief the Shadow Secretary.
Because I think in any crisis situation, the first thing to do is not to widen the scope. The first thing is to find the facts and then to start to brief others.
So what made you change your mind on this in due course? Was it just that you...
We just got to grips with... I mean, so I come into the situation where there's been this leak. We need to do something about it. We're going to put these programs in place. I need to find out the extent of it and fully understand what's behind it. And look, I know that Parliament always wants to know. I was a parliamentarian for 19 years, right? If I was your side of the... I'd be saying the same thing.
That's why we're so shocked.
And of course the media are keen to know. But the truth is, there are just times, folks, and this is the grown-up world we live in, where the executive power, the cabinet essentially, have to make decisions. I can give you many examples.
In a grown-up world, Sir Grant, with all due respect, while we're shocked that having been a parliamentarian for so long, that you decided to significantly curtail the workings of Parliament, of the Defence Committee. And why did you decide to exclude the then Chair of the Defence Committee? Did you not trust the Chair of the Defence Committee at the time?
It's not about trusting somebody or not trusting somebody. It's just about wanting to save lives. And if you want to save lives, then you will keep the information.
The Chair of the Defence Committee at the time would have stopped you from saving lives by briefing them.
So look, where you have a situation where not just the list, but the knowledge that the list exists could itself put people's lives at risk, you have to decide where that line is, where to draw that line. And my view was, first of all, establish the facts, and then we can start to brief people, and we did in the manner in which we've described. There are lots of things that we don't share with parliamentarians. Look, folks, I can say this now because I'm not a parliamentarian, right? The position of the nuclear subs, the codes. You know, there are just things that we cannot share. And I did not feel...
With all due respect, Sir Grant, I don't think that the Chair of the Defence Committee or the Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, who you decided you did not want to brief, that they would have been requesting you for nuclear codes, and likewise, I'm not requesting anybody for any nuclear codes or the like. But at the very least, I think it would have been courteous to extend that briefing to the Chair of the Defence Committee and the Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. But you decided not to do that. And that really has put your record in a bad light, wouldn't you say?
Look, I disagree, and I understand that the committee may disagree with me on this. But unless you sat in a chair where... and the committee will, I think, concede that the more people who know about it, the more people could know about it, because unfortunately things do get around. And the more it was talked of and known of, there was, even if it's a very small chance, 1% greater risk that might get out, then that's a 1% greater risk that people would die, including British forces.
But let's recognise the facts. There were several, and when I do mean several journalists, activists and Afghans that were all aware of the data breach. You know, the thing had been put on Facebook, for God's sake. You know, I'm sure the Chair of the Defence Committee and the Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee should have been made privy to that information. And in fact, there should have been a briefing given to all Defence Committee members. But you decided against that.
I just disagree. I just disagree. And no offence to anybody, and probably the members in this room were not the people on the committee necessarily, and some may have been. I disagree. Where there are people's lives at stake, there are just times where you have to use executive authority in order to protect lives. And I know this is not what people want to hear, and everyone thinks that everything should be shared all the time. As soon as you reach out further, there is a chance that somebody says something to someone and word gets back. And frankly, I'd rather be sat in front of you today explaining why I acted to save lives than sat in front of you today to try and explain why I didn't act and people died.
Yeah, but I think all of us are on the side of saving lives, on making sure that the right thing is done. you took a decision to keep that circle very, very tight,
Yes, correct.
just for yourself and a few of the officials,
including the
But I'm
opposition
sure-
and the leaders of the speakers of the House.
But with all due respect, the members of the Defence Committee are duly elected by the House. They have the trust and confidence of 650 fellow parliamentarians, and I am sure that those individuals who are regularly the outriders for defence, and I'm sure that's what committee members are doing at the moment, that our predecessor committee, that they should have had access to that, and that is what I think has actually led to this debacle being worse than it is, because those decisions weren't taken, and that's a deficiency in democratic accountability has led to the situation whereby we now all feel that the wrong decision was taken at the time.
I respectfully disagree. You've asked me here to tell you what I think, and what I think is everybody says, you can trust me, tell me on parliamentary terms, tell me on Privy Council terms, or tell me on... Everyone is going to say that. But the truth is, even if that made it 1% more likely that people would die as a result of the knowledge of this list spreading further, I was not prepared to take that risk. As simple as that. And look, there is always a proper balance between executive authority, parliamentary authority, the courts, and you may think I drew the line in the wrong place. I go to sleep at night knowing that I drew the line in the place where I thought most lives would be saved. And that's the decision I decided on.
I think we'll have to agree to disagree there, because we live in a parliamentary democracy. And I think that people should be, especially elected members to those respective committees, should be entrusted with that. But let me move on to Lincoln Job.
That would involve, just to probe that a little further, that would involve people who are not actually even privy councillors now having very top secret classified information. And I just think that in the real world, when it comes to saving lives, there are times when the state has to go about its business
in the
through
real
executive
world,
power.
when so many journalists, activists, Afghans, and all and sundry who are on Facebook already knew about it.
Well, look,
So
I'm not the courts, right? I wasn't the courts, and the courts decided on a super injunction. So the courts looked at this and decided it was serious enough that even the fact of there being an injunction couldn't be reported. I did not then want to go around undermining that by spreading the word further.
It's also my understanding that the courts were actually advising at the time that there is a lack of democratic accountability, and that perhaps other people should be briefed.
And you know, as we had those discussions, it was a developing situation. It wasn't the same on day one as it was in month 6. But as that situation developed, we indeed did widen the net of those who were briefed. And as I've already discussed, I felt that it was an injunction that could be probably lifted at around the autumn of 2024, and yet my successor actually decided, I'm not criticising, he would have had his own views on this, but to hold it in place for a whole another year. And I don't know whether my successor did or did not brief this committee during that time. I understand.
We will be questioning your successor.
Yeah. I mean, for a much longer period of time, somebody else came to the same decision, which is interesting to me.
It would seem reasonable to conclude, given the numbers of people who subsequently were allowed in, that vetting and the difficulty that you had of getting ground truth. Is it, in your view, do you think that we probably did let some Taliban in? Because, as you know, for having been there and served there, you know, being in the Taliban, they don't give you like a card, and you know, it's a pretty vague term.
I think, well, for some we had pretty good records. For some, I mean, again, people forget that there were a lot of champions of this. You know, I remember Richard Tice from Reform being, you know, no questions, we've got to get more people in, you know, we have a duty. The Daily Mail ran their campaign very successfully that actually transitioned from the EGS scheme, the ex gratia scheme, into the ARAP because of campaigns like run by the Daily Mail that we owe these people a duty. So I would often get grief for actually rejecting someone who had been an ARAP, but we had intelligence to say that they had been helping the Taliban on the other side. So we did take a precautious position. What I can't talk about is the ARR, when the ARAP morphed after I'd left, and what they did under the pressure of that leak and whether people dropped the bar. I think it would be helpful to all of us to know, because there's a lot of negativity about Afghans in this country being spread, especially by the hard right. I mean, you don't have to look at the Twitter feed of anyone who let them in are traitors and these people are all sex offenders. I would like from the Home Office actually the statistics of Afghans, but also how many were Arab. Because when I see a few cases in the media, they're not Arab. And there's a lot of success stories of Arab triples and people who came here, who have gone, who didn't hang around in hotels. They got a job, they worked, and they've been a great success in society. And we should celebrate that. And no one's talking about it. And I think it would be really helpful if we got some statistics from the government about that, so we can make that decision about did we let in some wrong-uns or not. I'm sure in a large-scale evacuation we didn't get everything right, but ultimately we tried to vet and we did as much as we could, and that's where we got the leak.